Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into the shocking story of American pickers. Some people live in their own homes and have never had to worry about money because they have never had it. World in which the things we value are never acknowledged, and you know what? They don't give a damn about what you own. They have never needed your money, thus they don't give a damn. But what happens if someone keeps secrets that will depart from the entire earth? Nobody could believe it when they discovered Fritz dead in his bathtub. A hidden collection valued at millions of dollars was waiting beyond the old garage door. USD with a 1947 Indian Chief prototype and more than 75 vintage motorcycles, a long-lost Aerosmith vehicle worth $250,000. And a Star Wars Yoda prototype that George Lucas believed had been destroyed. However, that was only the beginning. The handwritten notebooks were the most startling aspect, not the treasure. It exposed the sinister reality of Frank's last. Are you prepared to discover the mysteries behind the screen? Remember, if you identify with Fritz, please write a remark with the number 1, if not, use the number 0. To ensure you don't miss the startling disclosures in today's video, please be sure to like and subscribe to the channel right now. Narrative: a lot of individuals have never owned money. And they don't require money, therefore were frequently turned away in that manner because, well, they have never had money and will never have it, so they don't give a damn about those things. Nobody could have predicted what was concealed in his garage when they discovered Fritz dead on the floor of his toilet. Over 75 classic motorcycles in a hidden collection valued at millions of dollars, containing a unique 1947 Indian Chief prototype valued at the lost tour van of Aerosmith, a $250,000 Star Wars Yoda prototype that George thought to be destroyed. Lucas's wealth wasn't the biggest shock. Instead, it was the handwritten diaries that exposed the dark reality of his last days. Why he was actually expelled from American Pickers, and who attempted to embezzle his $6 million fortune. Born in 1963 in Davenport, Iowa, and even as a youngster, he was unlike other children. Frank occupied his room while the others were riding bikes or exchanging baseball cards. With old beer, rocks, money, and stamps. Cans, the boy accumulated items that his parents' bill went unnoticed by other children. Susan believed it to be a harmless habit, but Frank saw something about these forget objects that are valuable. The boy once claimed to have gathered a variety of it was so deep that he was even captivated by the paper clips from his school notebooks. By razor blades, which at the time appeared strange, but it was immediately apparent that growing up, Frank had a sharp eye for details that others missed. He met Mike Wolfe in the 8th grade at both Sutalo High School and Bettendorf High School. Initially clicked, and shortly after that they began spending weekends at garage sales and flea markets looking for treasure. The two lads were lured to the same markets. Some teachers have stories to share about unusual, dusty, neglected items. Frank took an alternative route since he didn't see college as necessary, even though he believed he could succeed with a regular degree. The location where he would acquire the most crucial wisdom, which he felt comes from experience, examining antiques, learning about their origins, and figuring out what made them valuable. Once high school graduation, Frank accepted a position as a fire inspector in charge of numerous large regions of Iowa. He worked there for almost 25 years, but his collecting passion never left him. In fact, it increased even more when he started purchasing. When he purchased a 1964 Harley-Davidson, he was just 16 years old. For more over $4,000, a substantial sum at the time. His parents were taken aback, but Frank saw it as a piece of history that he had worked so hard to create, not just a bike. Locations such as Coast to Coast Hardware and Quad City Automatic Sprinkler to cover his new passion. He ultimately amassed more than 100. He even constructed a barn to house all of his vintage motorcycles each year. Took part in South Dakota's Sturgis motorcycle rally and established a reputation among bikers. What set Frank apart long before he was on television wasn't just the things he gathered, but also the way he gathered it. He possessed what he referred to as a picker's eye, which allowed him to enter and check out what others have in an old warehouse or attic. He spent years investigating dusty structures and recording his discoveries. Intriguing artifacts and pondering the lives of those who formerly held them. He wasn't merely an object collector. He gathered their tales, and by doing so, he transformed himself from a mere collector into someone who witnessed every finding as a historical artifact preserved from the garbage. Despite his work as a firefighter, Inspector Frank's love of collecting grew even more when he examined antique. He frequently found abandoned objects in buildings, such as fire helmets, alarm bells, and antique tools were more than simply forgotten implements. They were remnants of the past, and Frank was able to identify them. His examinations turned into something more. Importantly, these were treasure hunts concealed by fire and safety records. Rules over time, the peculiar pairing of these daytime jobs. He became the specialist he would become because he was a picker at heart and an inspector. His attention to detail and ability to read a building were sharpened by inspection work. View what other overlooked that ability, which later came in handy when he went into warehouses or antique shops looking for hidden treasures. Didn't merely guess, he had a system in place for years of looking at threats and scanning walls. Let him later recognize what others had missed, which was advantageous. Amazing at American pickers as he searched through heaps of trash in search of anything actually important, a tiny gesture that altered everything. Frank purchased an antique item, a basic item, for only $15 before selling it for $475. From that sale stayed with him, but it wasn't simply the money that came in. Impression was recognizing the worth of the knowledge he had acquired during years of researching these items, and it was now paying. That transaction demonstrated to him that his passion could turn into a legitimate business. After that, he started to view collecting as a means of creating something rather than only as a pastime. So in 2002, Frank made the decision to make the change, leaving his position as a fire inspector and founded Frank's Finds, a store in Savannah, Illinois. But it was more than simply a business. It resembled a tiny museum with ancient tools, firefighting equipment, and the structure itself had history. It was an old opera theater, and most people had even forgotten about it. Featuring a bar, and entering it was like traveling back in time. Visitors reported that it was dark and had a musty smell, but to be honest, it was part of its charisma. His world was unadulterated, genuine, and full of personality. Over the years, the shop turned into a popular destination for collectors and interested tourists who came merely to observe the odd and amazing objects on exhibit. Not everyone was a fan of some people had trouble navigating the arrangement, but those who knew who Frank was could appreciate its benefits. When television called, the store and everything in it served as the basis for the next phase of his life. Frank was prepared. He only needed to be himself, the person who never gave up on the idea that every item had a backstory and saw riches where others saw rubbish. Prior to American Pickers becoming on television, Mike Wolfe had been using a camera to search for antique gems. He began documenting his travels in 2002, along with his my friend Frank. Fritz had recently quit his job at the stable as a fire inspector and established his own antique store in Savannah, Illinois, and was content with his shop filled with old toys, oil cans, and motorcycles that he didn't want to hit the way. But Mike saw something. He spent months attempting to persuade Frank that their treasure hunting excursions might be something much more. Frank wasn't sure if he loved the store, but it was solid in his. Something changed one day, and Frank purchased a tiny pin from a fraternal chapter for $115. Didn't seem like much, but he sold it for $1.50 later. He described the thrill he had at that moment as the gambler's rush. Inclination and Mike's persistent encouragement finally persuaded Frank to try it. He locked up, gathered his belongings, and go on the road with the earliest journeys that Mike recorded while traveling subsequently served as the source material that attracted TV producers' attention. When American Pickers debuted in January 2010, Everything Frank was transformed from a little store owner to a person who impacted millions of people. Watched weekly, almost 3 million people watched the first episode, making it one of history. Frank with his beard is one of the greatest debuts in history. Mike's vivacious personality was the exact antithesis of his sturdy frame and composed manner. Personality, which made him adored by others. Soon, fans were waiting in line to see them. There was a sizable throng when they visited the California Surf Museum in October. Frank was perplexed and questioned, "What are all these people doing?" as they gathered outdoors. Here, but he continued to sign autographs until there were only 8 people left. One of the show's episodes garnered 5.3 million views months after it debuted. Viewers saw that Frank had achieved stardom and that their initial travels were free experiences. Drove a white Mercedes truck around before transferring to a Ford Transit without any particular strategy. They came discovered Champion Auto in Arundel in September 2011 while traveling through southern Maine. Mario Bennett, who watched the show every week, was in full shock. Now the Frank purchased petrol, signs, and oil cans while stars were standing in his own yard. Station souvenirs, and Mike spent 5 days concentrating on motorbike equipment. Walking the trail and meeting people while exploring the area entirely unscripted. The magic 2 guys in a vehicle were pursuing the in the past. Frank and Mike's compliments were one of the reasons the show was successful. Mike was tall and slender, full of enthusiasm and vitality, and they were the best of one another. Mike adored vintage bicycles, whereas Frank was shorter, calmer, and more meticulous. When they went through the Volkswagens, Frank looked for toys, oil cans, and motorcycle paraphernalia. It was evident that Mike removed motorcycle parts from Mario's property in Maine, and Frank took gas. Mike once referred to Frank as a station sign, because they fit together like puzzle parts. Fans of dreamers who are kind, funny, and considerate also noticed that, and they admired the pair's eccentric pairing. Other individuals could identify with Frank's cautious. Mike's fast-paced style resonated more with others, which combined to become the feel more personally. As a teenager, Frank developed a passion for motorcycles long before the program. His parents were likely concerned when he purchased a 1964 Harley-Davidson, the first of several. He amassed a collection of over 35 vintage motorcycles over the years, kept in a warehouse that resembled a. He owned rare Indian motorcycles in the museum, featuring a 1938 4-cylinder motorcycle that he discovered in a Philadelphia warehouse. British motorcycles were also present. One of his most prized was the Vincent BSA Triumph. The Von Dutch XAVW was a 1942 Harley with a frame-powered engine by a Volkswagen engine that Von Dutch himself had painted after Frank had seen it in a magazine. He discovered it at a yard sale decades ago and was astounded. That bike, similar to numerous others in his What Mattered to Frank in 2013, was the story that the collection told. Chose to write a book titled How to Pick Vintage, to share what he knew. He wrote it for everybody who loves motorbikes, not just experts. I wished to begin collecting the book, which was jam-packed with advice, tales, and pictures. Based on his personal findings, he described how to negotiate, locate a deal, and what to search for in a hidden gem. His approach was straightforward, funny, and unambiguous. Like on television, the book served as a means for Frank to impart all of the knowledge he had acquired. Over the years, he wished for others to learn about the background of these devices and experience the same excitement that he did. When restoring one to life, one of Frank's passions was shaped by his prior work as a fire inspector. Memorabilia from the fire department. After 25 years of building inspection, he gained access to old fire stations, and abandoned firehouses are rarely seen by collectors. Someone who knew where to search could find all of the old equipment, so he began gathering it all. Old alarm systems, leather helmets, brass fire extinguishers, and even American. When they discovered anything connected to fire, you could feel the joy on his face. It wasn't just a category, it was personal, and what set Frank apart was his attitude toward collecting. He saw more than just things, he saw tales. Every object evoked a recollection of a location, time, or person he frequently spent more time with. He spent more time discussing the item's history with the seller than haggling over the price he was really interested in. Items that demonstrated how Americans used to live, such as abandoned equipment and goods, odd toys, he showed great reverence for war artifacts, occasionally contributing pieces to if museums had ties to warriors who had given their lives. That was Frank felt that these tales ought to be kept alive rather than imprisoned. Frank Fritz fought for a large portion of his life. He lived with Crohn's disease for more than 36 years, something most people had never witnessed. Illness, a debilitating and painful condition that made daily living challenging, particularly when filming. According to a close friend of his, American Pickers, Frank had been battling the illness since he was about 25 or 30 years old. He managed to endure the agony admirably in front of millions of people. Things became better when he watched him on TV without realizing what he was going through. He stopped drinking and concentrated on being sober, but his health declined as a result of years of stress and sickness. Until ultimately his body could no longer handle it. Bear died at the age of 60, and many people were unaware of how much he had suffered behind the scenes, and in 2017 the public started to learn about it. When the police stopped Frank for driving the wrong way, he admitted to them that he had been drinking and had taken. He failed the sobriety test for Xanax, a medication he claimed was prescribed to alleviate his anxiousness. Test and was accused of driving while intoxicated. He subsequently clarified that he claimed that the reason for his anxiousness was that he was constantly being seen and evaluated. Because everyone was watching him and he was under a lot of pressure, he accepted a plea deal to avoid going to jail. Bargain, but his name was tarnished. Frank Fritz had to go through a lot that nobody was aware of until the truth came out. His life was everything but simple. And the difficulties he encountered are a tale that few people fully comprehend. Can you relate to the strain he endured? Remember to like, share, and subscribe to this video by leaving your thoughts in the comments section below. Channel to find more heartwarming and intriguing secrets. That moment revealed the truth and demonstrated that not only did celebrity break him down, but also caused him to lose his friendship with co-star Mike Wolfe. By when Frank stated in 2021 that they hadn't spoken in 2 years, it wasn't the absence of employment, but the fact that Mike never phoned Frank. Felt after he had back surgery. He even jokingly said that the show was always unbalanced, as though Mike was the star and he was only the sidekick. Being with Steven Tyler in a band means you'll never be. Though when Mike wrote on the internet that he was missing Frank didn't think. He described it as phony and suggested that it might have been written by someone else because he didn't think Mike had ever said anything complimentary about him. In reality, but following years of conflict, they were reunited over Memorial Day weekend in May 2023. A mutual buddy assisted them in making it occur, but Frank's back agony during the pandemic didn't end there. He required surgery to move something at home, but the timing couldn't have been worse: lockdowns, isolation, and he developed an opiate addiction when all of the breakups occurred at once. Mike Wolfe initially did it to control the discomfort, but it quickly got out of hand. Claimed that it was similar to witnessing a tornado damage someone they were trying to assist, so they organized an intervention and begged him to clean up. Frank said he was all right, but he wasn't when the program requested his return. The last straw was when they requested a clean drug test, which he was unable to pass. The last episode of American Pickers Frank broadcast in March 2020 at first, it appeared like he only needed to rest in order to heal. He even later stated that he only underwent back surgery after COVID-19 struck, but by July 2021, he had not departed. Mike acknowledged that he wouldn't. He sent a note wishing Frank the best upon his return, but that was the only thing that went on behind the scenes had changed. Frank had had extensive surgery, requiring 185 stitches and 2 metal rods. His spine, stating that he was excited to return to work after being totally recovered. Once again, but the network didn't bring him back because they had other plans, and according to that choice devastated him. He felt pushed aside and forgotten by people closest to him. His condition continued to deteriorate after that. On July 14, Frank Fritz's life altered. In the morning of 2022, a buddy discovered Frank resting on his Iowa farm. He was motionless on the floor and unable to speak to his companion right away. He might be having a seizure, the friend claimed when calling 911, and he is unable to speak to me. At the age of 59, Frank had endured. He was admitted to the hospital after suffering a major stroke, but his brain damage was after a month. His condition had gotten so bad that he was unable to walk or think clearly. In the medical facility, he was moved to a nursing home, which was only the start of a protracted and agonizing struggle for existence. Even Frank still needed constant care when he eventually got home. As health continued to deteriorate, many emergency calls were made, including one where he had to return to the hospital due to pneumonia, and as the weeks passed, it became evident that Frank was no longer possessed authority over his life, or the court stepped in and appointed Frank's friend in August 2022. A bank was designated to make personal decisions for Chris Davis. Manage his roughly $6 million worth of assets. According to court records that made clear the circumstances, Frank was unable to take care of himself and make sure he had food, accommodation, or even basic medical care without assistance. He ran the risk of suffering severe injuries or dead, but even with assistance, things weren't simple. The bank and the Guardian were judges examined their activities annually under court pressure to make sure Frank was receiving the care he needed. Claps, 4, followed by the expense. Frank had made millions of dollars during his savings swiftly disappeared during his tenure on American Pickers, and he spent about his sole source of income at the time was $30,000 per month for medical expenses, which added up to about $350,000 annually. Was roughly $60,000 annually from investments, but it wasn't sufficient, to be honest. Required round-the-clock nursing care, specialized equipment, physical therapy, and care for more severe illnesses such as Crohn's disease. And Jerry Jandro, a close friend of his, mentioned even the idea of selling Frank's antiques at auction after his death was discussed, and I believe he would do incredibly well. Jerry stated that his fan base would eventually support that through an auction. Jerry described visiting Frank as heartbreaking on one side as his condition deteriorated. Didn't work at all. When he attempted to raise his arm, it simply fell, as Jerry remembered, making it even more agonizing. Was that Frank was fully aware of what was happening to him and the amount of worsened to the point where he was unable to walk, speak, or move as before. Jerry thought that Frank had lost his drive to fight when people became exhausted. He claimed, people frequently lose their will to live. I genuinely believe that he could have lived longer had he not given Mike Wolfe made the last decision on September 30, 2024. The long-standing American Pickers co-star of Frank was told that Frank was Mike hurried to his side after swiftly declining, and he held Frank's hand for an hour. Speaking to him while massaging his chest, Mike remarked, "I told him that I loved him just and that I wasn't angry with him." Mike sent Frank a final message before he passed away, saying, "Go find your mother, "Go find her." Mike was present when Frank passed away at 8:50 p.m. Additionally, there were her mother and her best friend, Annette Overberlander. Afterwards, she said that Mike stayed with Frank to the end of his life and that he was always there for him. They both desired no one could have when Fritz died in September 2024. Envisioned what would be kept buried for many years behind the old garage door. More than 75 vintage motorcycles, each with a unique tale, was something extraordinary. Each one was a slice of history. Some were corroded and covered in dust, while others appeared to have just been rolled off the factory floor. The oldest bike was dated 1912, and some were obviously waiting for a second chance. Despite uncommon prototypes that specialists thought were permanently gone, the most nobody knew that Frank had secretly gathered all of these. Only a select group of close pals were aware of all he had concealed, yet collectors and museums around the world were agog after the news broke, with many speculating that this might be one of the biggest motorbike finds in decades as individuals searched one bike. The 1922 Ace 4 was even more amazing when the features were examined closely. Purchased for about $45,000 during a noteworthy American Pickers, is currently valued at around $200,000. The 1939 Indian 4 is known as the Aristocracy and is worth more than pre-war Indian Scouts, including a 1928 model with the original, cost $115,000. Frank also owned 3 Harley-Davidson Panhead models from the 1950s, with the paint still intact. Each in varying degrees of restoration, but the most unexpected was a 1947 Indian Chief. Experts claim that the prototype's design was unique compared to other models. Might be valued at more than $250,000, but this wasn't just because of the motorcycles. Special collection. They were accompanied by numerous handwritten journals that had been meticulously kept for more than 30 years. Frank documented the origins of